Tonight's topic is infectious disease. This evening's panelists are local experts and luminaries on the cause, treatment, and prevention of existing and emerging infectious diseases. And I'd like to thank them for their tireless efforts related to infectious disease and public health, and for their willingness to add their knowledge and experience to tonight's discussion. And thank you, the audience, for attending this forum. The list of infectious agents that threaten our well-being and public health is long and grows continually. Due to the shortage of flu vaccine this year, the influenza virus is the germ du jour at the forefront of people's minds right now. And while it's one of the more commonplace pathogens, its effects and complications can be serious or even fatal, causing tens of thousands of deaths each year in the U.S. alone. Then we have a host of recently emerging infectious entities such as Lyme disease, SARS, West Nile virus, Monkeypox, and HIV/AIDS, and to that the potential for a pandemic from avian flu and the potential release of bioterrorist pathogens, and we have a lot to be concerned about. But there is much that we, as physicians, and you, our patients, can do to protect ourselves, our loved ones, and our communities from the threats of infectious disease. We need a more intensive public health focus and a partnership with patients and government to improve our chances of preventing or mitigating infectious disease epidemics or pandemics. I encourage everyone in the audience to listen to the presentations, then to ask questions and share your ideas during the open discussion. We do have a lot to cover, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's moderator. You know her best as the award-winning co-anchor of WCVB News Center 5. Please join me in welcoming Liz Brunner. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. As Al mentioned, I am with WCVB Channel 5, and I co-anchor the 5:30 and the 11 o'clock broadcasts on Channel 5, and have been doing, I've been there 11 years now, although I've only been on the evenings for about the last 4 years or so. And I also, as part of some of my responsibilities, besides being a reporter for a myriad of topics, whether it's politics or fun things, I also do a lot of health beat reporting as well. And so there's a personal interest in my being here this evening, and obviously yours as well, for joining us tonight. As Al mentioned, we're here tonight to sort of explore a myriad of topics. Everything from the shortage of the flu vaccine, we're hearing about it just about every single day, and we're doing stories about it just about every single day. We're also talking a lot about West Nile virus, Eastern equine encephalitis, bird flu, and those types of things. And tonight we're going to explore whether or not we've created hybrid flus. What about Lyme disease and SARS, and what is causing some of these new diseases that we're hearing so much about? What is the connection between the animal interaction and human beings when it comes to these infections? And what about our environment as it relates to our food supply? Many, many questions, and how do we protect ourselves? How do we protect our children? So the only other question I have of you as the audience before I introduce our panelists tonight is, how many of you are in the medical profession one way or another, just by a show of hands? Just a few of you, and the remainder of you are here as interested citizens, I'm guessing. Oh, I feel like the microphone just came on. Can you all hear me all right? Yeah. Terrific. Okay, good, good. So some of you are medical officials involved in the medical field in some way. The rest of you are here just out of curiosity, all kinds of interest. Oh, very, very good. Our three panelists tonight are here to tackle some of those things that we just talked about, and we have a great group tonight, so let me introduce them to you. The first person I want to introduce tonight is Dr. Alfred D. Maria, and you may know him best. He's on Channel 5 a lot for doing medical stories with us. He's the Chief Medical Officer and State Epidemiologist for the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. He is a graduate of Harvard Medical School and a board certified in internal medicine and infectious disease. Dr. De Maria is the state's leading voice on public health and infectious disease and serves on the Medical Society's Committees on Public Health and Physician Preparedness. Also joining us tonight, Dr. Thomas Treadwell. Dr. Treadwell is the director of the Infectious Disease Clinic and director of the HIV Travelers and STD Clinics at Metro West Medical Center in Framingham. A lot of words in those titles, gentlemen. A graduate of Dartmouth Medical School, Dr. Treadwell is also board certified in internal medicine and infectious disease and is a fellow of the Infectious Disease Society of America. And finally tonight, Dr. Marcus. Dr. Marcus is a consultant with Tropical Medical and Travelers Health in Newton. former president of the American Committee on Clinical Tropical Medicine and Travelers' Health, a graduate of the Albert Einstein College of Medicine and Yeshiva University. Dr. Marcus, also a doctor of veterinary medicine, serves on the Medical Society's Public Health, Physician Preparedness, and Environment and Occupational Health Committees. Whew. Thank you, gentlemen. Please give them a warm welcome before we begin. We're going to give each panelist about 10 minutes or so to sort of introduce themselves a little bit more in some of their area of expertise. I believe we've passed out some index cards, which I want to encourage you to use to write down some specific questions that you may have, which we're going to try and get to after their presentations. And I really would like this to just be very much an open dialogue, a conversation about what you're interested in, and I'll have some questions of my own as a journalist reporter. I often do. And then, of course, they may touch base with one another about various things as well and comment on each other's topics. So I'm going to begin with introductions. Dr. Marcus, why don't you begin this evening and set the stage for us, if you will. Would you feel more comfortable just doing it from there, or you want to come up here? All right. Come on up.
Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to Fort Hall Forum for inviting me. At the time that I graduated from medical school, which was back in the 1960s, many luminaries in organized medicine were advising the graduates at that time to find some specialty other than infectious disease to go into, because this was clearly a dying field. We had all the antibiotics that we needed to cure the infections that were the ailments of the day, and if we didn't want to see ourselves in the unemployment line, then we should seek some more remunerative phase of medicine. Well, I sort of fought that tide, and furthermore said that I was really interested in the interaction of animals and humans in infectious disease, which was really a hopeless situation at that time, so I was truly destined to be one of the unemployed. But times have changed, and I have finally been vindicated. So the situation now is that there are an increasing number of emerging diseases that have come out. It's hard to pin down an exact number because it depends on how you define that term. And it not only refers to diseases that have not been described previously, but also refers to the term reemerging diseases, meaning old problems that have come again and reemerged as new threats in a new garb, if you will. So, for example, yellow fever, which has been one of the most ancient of known disease problems, has reemerged as a new problem in South America and Africa when it seemingly was getting largely under control. But roughly, there's been about an average of one brand new disease per year discovered since the 1970s, and 75% of them are zoonotic, which means they are diseases that are transmitted from animals to people. So what I want to address tonight is the reason for that. And there's two phases of it. One is technical, and we have increasing technology, various genetics type studies, DNA studies, PCR, polymerase chain reaction. So those of you who saw Jurassic Park are familiar with PCR, but basically it's a way of finding evidence of infection with looking for DNA for genetic material, and it's a relatively new technology with many new ramifications, and it permits discovery in a more rapid fashion and a more precise fashion than technology that was available to us 20, 30, 40 years ago. And so it becomes a circuitous type of logic. The more technology we have, the easier it is to find new agents. The more new agents we find, the more intensively we look for them, and the more we look for them, the more we find. And so round and round it goes, and that fuels the energy to look and discover these things. There are, in addition, issues about bioterrorism, and that is not going to be the subject of our discussion tonight, except in two contexts. Number one, I said I was going to talk on zoonoses, and the vast majority of agents of bioterrorism are zoonotic. The major exception to that is smallpox, and almost every other one that is talked about is a zoonotic disease. Secondly, there are a lot of agents that are terrorism agents. In other words, they are diseases that could be introduced to our livestock and cause major economic devastation. So while they may not be public health problems, they can threaten the health of our animals with major economic impact. Now, because of our security awareness, there's increasing lookout for these kinds of problems, and it provides for more likely discovery of emerging diseases, because in the process of considering every new outbreak, the question is immediately, is this a terrorist agent or is it not? This was one of the considerations when West Nile virus first appeared. Was it bioterrorism, which of course it turned out not to be, but it certainly fueled a lot of the energy that went into the research and studies about that condition. And going now from those aspects, what are the particular ecological considerations that are causing the increase of zoonotic diseases? There are three different aspects of it. There are changes that are occurring in the human host, there are changes that are occurring in the pathogens, and there are changes that occur in the environment. As far as the human host is concerned, there are a number of different processes that cause an increased number of immunosuppressed individuals in our population today. Of course, one major one is AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, which in itself emerged as a zoonotic disease, probably from the butchering and consumption of chimpanzees in Africa. Almost certainly was the origin of that major epidemic devastation that we deal with today. But as a result of AIDS infections, people had suppressed immunity, and the nature of any organism is that over time it evolves so that it learns to accommodate to the pathogens, the germs that normally would attack it. When your immunity is suppressed, then you become susceptible to organisms that don't normally attack you. So there's an innate resistance or inability of germs that belong in a certain host to get into a different host. You wouldn't expect canine distemper to get into a human being, okay? And there are many different germs that are specific for a particular host. But when your immunity drops, then all of a sudden some of those host barriers break down. So it's not surprising that many of the opportunistic infections associated with immune suppression are zoonotic. And it's not only AIDS, but the fact we have advanced cancer chemotherapy, organ transplants, and other reasons why people are immunosuppressed by medical care that make for a greatly increased number of people who are susceptible to these organisms. The next issue is the change in the pathogen, and there I will just limit myself to a discussion of antibiotic resistance. So Salmonella and Campylobacter are two bacteria that are commonly found in the intestinal tract of a great variety of animals, including birds and mammals, reptiles, and the change that has occurred is because of antibiotic pressure. Many of them have evolved so that they are resistant to those antibiotics. So this is part of the emerging disease picture. And part of it is the problem with agriculture and with veterinary medicine, which has used some antibiotics inappropriately for growth factors in meat production, dairy production, and the evolving antibiotic resistance in those organisms now threaten our health. Lastly, I want to address the changes in environment, which is by far the most complex issue of all, and in itself could be an entire hour's subject, plus many times over. Trying to accelerate the discussion on that, we have an increased rate of deforestation, which permits contact with animal species that have never been routinely encountered before. It permits a greatly increased bush meat trade to occur so that you can buy illegal endangered animal products all over Europe and Asia that are brought out of the jungles of Africa with the increased deforestation that you have there. There is trade, both legal and illegal, in animal parts for food products, for medicinal uses. And we deliberately take ourselves into this area with a great boom in ecotourism. So a major part of my own private practice is traveler's health, and I routinely see people going into jungles, desert regions, and other places that would have been unheard of for people to go for vacation 20, 30 years ago, and now is quite routine. And we like to have, it's a funny love-hate relationship we have with animals. We like to eat them, we also like to keep them as pets. And so we keep exotic pets, and when you bring in wonderful creatures like Gambian giant rats into your home, that's a nice cuddly creature to play with, it can bring in certain problems, and that's how monkeypox got introduced to this country. We change our environment locally. We don't have to look at deforestation in Africa. We could look at the changing patterns within the United States and within New England, where we've gone from a very forested area when the settlers first came over here to deforestation and farm development, and then abandonment of farms and development of suburbs and people moving into the cities, permitting these old farm areas to get reforested, become suitable habitat for deer in a way that far exceeds anything that was known in pre-colonial days. We've managed to destroy all the natural predators of deer, so we no longer have timber wolves or mountain lions in this part of the country to help control them. So the deer have way overpopulated, and along with it come certain problems, such as Lyme disease, where the tick is dependent to a large extent, not totally, but to a very large extent, dependent on deer for its host-parasite relationship. And that tick transmits Lyme disease, babesiosis, ehrlichiosis. These are infectious diseases, all of which are transmitted by the deer tick. And the explosion of those infections are entirely environmentally related. And the last example that I will give of local problems of that sort is the raccoon rabies situation. Back in the 1970s, there was a move to bring raccoons from Florida and Georgia up into the West Virginia area because local hunters thought they just didn't have enough raccoons to hunt. And there were plenty of raccoons there, but they wanted a few more, and so they brought them in from the only part of the country that had native raccoon rabies. It was unknown in that area up until that time, and with its introduction, the disease spread in exploding fashion and has, of course, moved up the East Coast and is now a highly endemic problem throughout New England, and has cost millions and millions of dollars in attempts at control and treatment of potentially exposed individuals, and clearly is a human-induced problem in every sense of the word. And we have made our homes just an ideal habitat for the raccoon, which is a far more likely creature to be encountered in the cities and suburbs than out in the woods. And they not only bring rabies, but a roundworm, technically called Bacillus ascaris, another new emergent infection. So raccoons are wonderful animals from the public health standpoint. They keep us in business. So without taking any more time, I think I've sort of given you examples and an overview of the reason why so many of our emerging diseases are animal-related.
Thank you, Dr. Marcus. Fascinating stuff. I hope you're thinking and making notes on questions that you'd like to consider as we go forward. Dr. Treadwell, please.
Lenny, you have much more interesting practice than I do. I get back, I try to go to the jungle once a year to bird watch. I got back yesterday, actually. And the deforestation issue, although Costa Rica actually is booming economy relative to other Central American countries, is because it has preserved large tracts of primary forest. Still, the country is largely deforested. And I went to see these exotic birds, but I have to tell you, one of the most interesting birds I saw was one of my favorite creatures. I don't know how many of you know what a wood thrush looks like. Hyla cichlimustelina, one of the premier songsters in the world, actually. When I got up my first morning, I had to actually kick it out of the path. It was sitting there. You seldom see it in New England. You hear it all the time. It's a beautiful songster. And it's in trouble, not only because of deforestation in Central America, but because we've lost a lot of its habitat in New England, and that's a story that's sad when it's repeated. Well, Lenny's told you the interesting animal-human story, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about a local perspective, what's happened in the suburbs. I'm a suburb boy, and I actually appreciate having this out in Waltham, if I can have a vote. In the winter of 1976, I was a medical student in New Hampshire, and I admitted a Vermont farmer to the hospital where I was training with severe pneumonia. And initial studies failed to reveal the cause of his pneumonia, and despite what we called appropriate antibiotics, that was, in this case, everyone we had on the shelf, he got sicker, got put in the intensive care unit on a breathing machine, and was desperately ill for several weeks in the intensive care unit for 6 of them. I can remember one night my senior resident telling me that I should say goodbye to the patient, whom I became very attached to because he wasn't going to be there in the morning. Somehow we pulled through. The diagnosis was viral pneumonia. I had no idea what it was. Several months later, and in fact one day before I graduated, I got a nice present from the chief of medicine. He told me that the CDC had called him and said that the patient had survived Legionnaire's disease, and was the first case of sporadic Legionnaire's disease in New England at that time, in northern New England. You'll recall that it was just prior to that there was a devastating outbreak in Philadelphia affecting Legionnaires with several fatalities. Al, how many fatalities were there, do you know?
It was like 35, 40.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And that was certainly piqued my interest in infectious disease. And after my residency, actually, I came back to Boston and joined a laboratory where Dr. DeMaria was a junior faculty member. He was and is a wonderful mentor to me and countless other fellows. It's worth noting that my fellowship at the Finland laboratory began 3 days before the first description of the HIV epidemic by the CDC, July 3rd, 1981. Since that time, and since I was a medical student, there's just been a laundry list of important infectious diseases. I'll only mention the ones in North America, most of which I've seen in my practice or as a trainee. Toxic shock syndrome, shortly after the discovery, I saw a patient in California with that. A newly described illness, not a new illness, it's probably been around for a long time, caused by the Staphylococcus, but its association with tampon use led to an explosive outbreak and the description of the disease. There's been several diseases, most of which Lenny's mentioned, that are Rocky Mountain spotted fever-like tick-borne illnesses that have been described, previously only described in animals. It includes a malaria-like pathogen, Babesia, which mostly affects immunocompromised patients in the past, but now is fairly common in New England. And then ehrlichiosis, a Rocky Mountain spotted fever-like illness, milder, previously known only in animals and now found with some regularity. Lenny sees it more than I do, but in New England and tick-borne. And then, of course, the granddaddy of all vector-borne diseases in North America, Lyme infection, discovered in New England. There's been a litany of a whole list of viral illnesses, the alphabet soup of hepatitis viruses. When I was a student, we only knew hepatitis A and B. Hepatitis C is one of the largest epidemics, in numbers probably tenfold as common as HIV infection and spread the same way, so the patients often have both. But there's also hepatitis D, Delta infection. One of the largest outbreaks occurred in Worcester when I was in training. And hepatitis E, a hepatitis A-like infection. In Framingham, we saw one of the first imported cases several years ago. And then hepatitis G. My secretary was typing this up, and we're overwhelmed with hepatitis C. And she said, I didn't know there was any viruses past C, but if you have any patients with them, would you tell them to go to another clinic? And then, of course, some other newly described viral illnesses, the appearance of West Nile, which is now, of course, a very, very important illness nationwide. It actually largely spared the Northeast this year, mostly on the West Coast. Last year, mostly affecting the Platte River, and then got its way to California. I finished a backpack trip and got out. The first thing I picked up was a newspaper to find that there was a fatality in Tulare County where I'd been hiking. So I was glad not to have bitten by mosquitoes. Now, worldwide, the HIV pandemic and emergence of SARS have dominated and as well as important antimicrobial resistance, the sad story of malaria, resistance in malaria, terrible resistance in tuberculosis, where there's epidemics in Africa and Russia of multi-resistant TB, and then antibiotic resistance to other pathogens such as Salmonella, Shigella, and other sexually transmitted diseases. But I wanted to spend the rest of my few minutes talking about more local issues. In 1984, I asked Al, I needed some career advice. I said, what should I do? The funding in our laboratory was getting a little scarce, and so he told me I should go west. And so I did. I went to Framingham, where I've been for the last 20 years. And I have to tell you, I was really reluctant. In fact, our boss at that time tried to talk me to come back with some new funding. And I didn't, because I found that life for me in Framingham was good. I said, when I go out there, I'll never see another case of HIV infection. And I want to focus on three things that emerged in Framingham. We talk about emerging disease, but let me tell you what's emerged in the suburbs. When I came to Framingham, there was no HIV infection, and since that time I've seen more than 300 cases. We started a clinic in '86 because the numbers got, although certainly not the numbers they see in urban centers, still significant. We now care for more than 150 patients with HIV infection right here in Framingham. We have an immigrant flavor. You'll be surprised to know that Framingham, a fairly vanilla town, you think of Framingham, you think of Sharper's World. But in fact, we now take care of more African patients with HIV infection than African Americans. And several interesting problems, one of which that most of them are infected with serotypes of HIV-1 that typically weren't found in North America and in the past were harder to detect and quantify. That's actually been taken care of. When I got to Framingham, there was no Lyme infection in Framingham. The vector wasn't there, the tick wasn't there, the deer herd was, I never saw a deer in Framingham, and now I see them almost every morning. And although it's not epidemic in Framingham, tick-borne illness is certainly common. We see it from about April until September, October. And in the past month, I've saw 2 cases of Lyme meningitis. Not particularly scary illness. No one dies of Lyme infection. In fact, the only fatality of Lyme that I know of, Lenny reported many years ago. Try to keep that in perspective. But I want to end by talking about something a little bit closer to home, and that's antibiotic resistance. When I got to Framingham, there was very few resistant bacteria. And although it's not to the same level as it is in Boston teaching hospitals, for example, nevertheless it's become a problem not only in our hospital, but in our community. And I want to mention a little bit about the Staphylococcus. The Staphylococcus, how many of you know what the Staphylococcus is? It's a common bacteria. In fact, if you cultured our noses, about 1 in 5 of us have it in our noses. It sits there, doesn't do much of anything. But it can cause serious disease, particularly in debilitated or hospitalized patients. It can also cause annoying and occasionally severe infection, boils, if you will, in the community. The story of the Staphylococcus is a sad one. In 1950, virtually all of the Staphylococci were sensitive to good old-fashioned penicillin. And you don't have to be a Darwinian expert to know that when you put pressure on a microbe, it will change. And the Staphylococcus changed pretty quickly, and by the mid-1950s, most Staphylococci were resistant to penicillin and other commonly used antibiotics. So we built a better mousetrap, and we came up with a drug called methicillin and some related fancy penicillins, and these drugs are very effective, in fact, remain the mainstay of treating most staphylococcal infections. But it didn't take the staff long to figure out that a way to become methicillin resistant. And methicillin resistant staphylococci, we call them fondly MRSA, have been a major problem in our teaching hospitals and our big urban hospitals since the 70s. And when I came to Framingham, there was virtually no MRSA at our hospital. When we had a MRSA patient, we usually blamed it on a downtown teaching hospital transferring a patient infected to Framingham. Now, 50% of our hospital staphylococci are MRSA, methicillin resistant. And these aren't more dangerous, but they're more difficult, more expensive to treat. But one of the things we never saw in the community, with rare exception, are MRSA infections arising in patients who have not been in the hospital or a nursing home. And a couple of years ago, there was a fairly interesting outbreak in Los Angeles of boils, of skin disease. It was in prisoners, actually, who frequently apparently shared towels and other objects. And it was initially thought to be spider bites. Now, no one asked Lenny, because Lenny would have told him that the brown recluse spider is not found in Los Angeles. But this outbreak of brown recluse spider bites turned out to be a new strain, one of two new strains of MRSA, or MRSA. These strains are a little bit different. They're a little bit easier to treat. That's the good news. But the bad news, that most of the strains have a gene called the Panton leukocidin gene, which makes these bacteria very aggressive, contagious, and actually the ability to cause boils. And we now are regularly seeing this in Framingham. We're seeing 1 or 2 new cases a week. We don't suspect it. The clinicians in the community don't suspect it. And what happens is the patient gets put on penicillin, and it gets a little bit better, and then the boil comes back, and then a light comes on, and it turns out it's a MRSA infection. Again, somewhat easy to treat, but troublesome because they tend to come back and cause outbreaks. There was a spectacular outbreak recently in Connecticut college football team that involved several individuals. Most of them were, by the way, the wide, I guess the defensive backs, the ones that get pummeled the most and scraped across the artificial turf. So what should we do? Should we stay indoors and when we venture outside only wear masks and gloves, wring our hands, and for goodness sake stay out of the high grass? And I think first of all some common sense that most of these infections are treatable. They're preventable, and there are virtually none of them cause serious disease in a normal patient. But I have a few things I think that I think we should take home with us. And when I used the men's room before I started here, I noted that there was a hand washing sign in there. And if your mother told you it was good for you, chances are it's correct. And good hand washing, certainly in the hospital, and certainly at home when there's an outbreak of skin disease or even respiratory illness, good hand washing has been shown to slow the spread of even respiratory viruses. We should vaccinate earlier and more often. Now, I'm not going to mention more about that. It's a sort of a thorny issue right now, and I'll let Al DiMaria talk his way out of that. We should be developing more vaccines, and Al was telling me earlier about a new meningitis vaccine that will soon be available, but certainly vaccinations have always been the most cost-effective ways to reduce the spread of infectious diseases and to limit mortality from infectious diseases. The spread of resistant microbes is not a coincidence, and Lenny mentioned already the importance of kilotons of antibiotics put in an animal feed. But we also give kilotons of antibiotics to our patients, more than 100 million oral antibiotic prescriptions. A lot of it you can blame on the doctor because it's a lot easier to give a prescription than to talk your way out of it. But the expectation of patients when they go to the doctor's office with a cold or with a respiratory infection, they're going to leave with an antibiotic. And nowadays with telemarketing, with TV ads, they not only tell you they want an antibiotic, they tell you which one. And I think that we have to educate each other about the fact that you don't need an antibiotic for everything. And then finally, we need more research and development for antibiotics. When I was a fellow, we funded our laboratory in part by doing antibiotic research. There seems to me there was a new fancy penicillin or a mycin every other day. And in the past 2 years, I believe there's been 2 non-HIV antibiotics released for use in the United States. And it's kind of a sad. We have to build better mousetraps. And I guess to answer the question, what's next, we hope it's new vaccines and antibiotics and not a new virus. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Treadwell. Dr. DiMaria, you're up next.
Thank you. It's certainly a privilege to participate in such a historic institution as the Ford Hall Forum, so I really appreciate that. And I'm very happy that the Medical Society has entered into this collaboration. I think we have the best state medical society in the country in Massachusetts for a number of reasons, and this enhances that as well. And it's a privilege to be on a panel with 2 of the most outstanding infectious disease specialists in the area, who I've known for many years, and I'm really happy that they're here. Now I'm a bureaucrat, so now I used to be a doctor, as they say, and Tom will tell you, I used to be able to draw the molecular structure of antibiotics. Now I have trouble remembering how to spell cefuroxime. But anyway, it is a privilege to be here, and I'm very appreciative of this opportunity to talk to you about emerging infections, because basically emerging, and by the way, if you're thinking about getting an appointment with either of these two guys, you're too busy, you won't be able to get an appointment. And I think that reflects on what Len said about the advice we all got when we entered this field, is that it wouldn't be around much longer. And I think that missed the point that emerging infections have occurred, are occurring, and will continue to occur. And what's really changed is not that there are emerging infections, because we can give you examples. You heard a lot of examples. Some of these are new, but some of these are very old diseases, will continue to occur as long as there are people and microbes, and hopefully that'll be for a long time. And what's really changed is how we live, where we live, how we eat, what we eat, where we travel to, what kind of medical care we get. All of these things contribute to emerging infections. And you've already heard of about a number of examples, and I think how we use antibiotics affects antibiotic resistance. And the fact that we have antibiotics allows for the emergence of antibiotic resistance, which is driven by the exposure to those antibiotics. And also how we live in the suburbs now and how we landscape those suburbs make a big difference to those deer. I think anybody who has a garden knows what the deer are eating. That was not the case 100 years ago, because people were shooting the deer and they weren't allowing them to eat their shrubbery. So those conditions did not exist. Another example would be tularemia. Tularemia occurs in Massachusetts, primarily on Martha's Vineyard. Before 1937, there were no reported cases of tularemia in Massachusetts. The only cases, we had 4 cases I was able to go to the archives, the vault, to look at the old data, and we only had 4 cases reported in Massachusetts. Every single one was acquired in another state. What happened in 1937, cottontail rabbits were imported for hunting purposes, again, another example, to Massachusetts, and all of a sudden we had tularemia on Cape Cod, where rabbits were introduced, and tularemia in the Merrimack Valley, where rabbits were introduced within 6 to 8 months. So a good example of something that was done for one reason that had implications in terms of emerging infections in Massachusetts. Another good example is the food that we eat. When I was growing up, I grew up in Revere. We moved there in the 1950s. Now, many of you know Revere. Do you imagine Revere as a farming community? And when we moved there was an active piggery. There was pork production in the city of Revere. And there were truck farms. There were actually vegetables for the Boston market were raised in Revere. My mother's relatives from East Boston referred to moving to Revere as moving to the country. It's unbelievable when you think about that. Tom talked about Framingham. I wasn't kidding when I said go west, because when I was growing up, we had relatives in Framingham. We never visited because they were too far away. Literally. So the way we live now is very different. The food that we eat now is not coming from Revere. It's not coming from the Blackstone Valley and the farms in central Massachusetts. It's coming from Chile. It's coming from South Africa. Parsley grown in Central America can cause foodborne illness in Finland and in the United States, and that has happened. We have had major foodborne outbreaks. They're major in the sense, 50 years ago, when the food that you ate came from locally, there was probably actually more foodborne illness than there is now. But it would happen, whole families would have food poisoning. And they would either get over it, unfortunately occasionally they would die from it. But now, 1 million to 10 million people get their food from one source, whether it's raspberries from Central America with cyclospore on them causing cyclosporiasis, or it's parsley with salmonella, or it's other vegetables, cantaloupes with salmonella or shigella. All of these things are happening and have happened. Now, fortunately, we can have fresh fruit 12 months a year, and we can have a lot of other foods that we were never able to have before, but they come with a price, and that price is potential exposure. Now, 50 years ago, to get salmonella, you'd have to have a lot of salmonella to cause infection. Now, all of these foods have very little salmonella. Let's use salmonella as an example. Very little, but it goes to 1 million people. So even if the attack rate is 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000, that causes thousands of cases of disease spread over the entire United States. So it's very hard to notice that. You know, you have a salmonella here, a salmonella there, a salmonella there. As opposed to an outbreak, you know, at a wedding party or a church supper where, you know, 80 out of 100 people get sick because they were exposed to a large amount of infectious agent. Now, infectious agent is spread over. So the same number of people can be infected, but they're spread over a large population. You don't really identify the outbreaks. It's made public health that much harder. We have another, eggs. Now, 1 in 10,000 eggs, it's estimated, has salmonella in it. If you cracked that egg and drank it, probably nothing would happen because it's only a few salmonella. It's actually in the egg. If the salmonella grew enough in the egg, if the egg was left out at room temperature or at a warm temperature and grew enough, you wouldn't eat that egg, whether you cooked it or not. But what happens is when you pool eggs, cracked eggs, that salmonella can then grow in the eggs. Does anybody know what the Monte Cristo sandwich is? Has anyone had one recently? Well, after in 1992, 69% of all outbreak salmonella enteritidis, which is the egg-associated salmonella, were related to one menu item, the Monte Cristo sandwich. Because what would they do? They would break all the eggs in the morning for, let's say, for brunch. They put it in a big bowl, like 100 eggs in a big bowl, whatever, 50 eggs. And it would sit out there on the counter while they were making these sandwiches. And the Monte Cristo sandwich is cheese, turkey, and ham between 2 slices of bread. They dip it in the egg wash, as they say in the food industry, and grill it. Well, what happens? If you made French toast that way, nothing would happen because all of the egg would be cooked and the salmonella would be killed. But the sandwich, by osmotic action, not osmotic, capillary action, the egg would go into the sandwich in between the layers and not get cooked. And that egg could have salmonella in it. Because it was sitting around, it might have enough salmonella to cause illness. And that's what led to it. So how, you know, the Monte Cristo sandwich was a product of all of these sort of new foods that we're eating. And again, many of the menu items on menus today would never have been seen on menus 50 years ago. And now that because of the eggs, because of the Monte Cristo sandwich, we had a major problem with egg-related salmonellosis. I started calling it Il Panino de Morte, the sandwich of death. That, more than anything else, that helped getting it off menus because it was a very popular food source. Another example is how we travel, and both Len and Tom run very active travel clinics. They see many, many people travel. We travel much more, and now we can travel very quickly. 50 years ago, 100 years ago, it was hard to get from one place to another within the incubation period of an illness. So in other words, illnesses would run their course on those ships. And one of the reasons we had quarantine, where ships were left out in the harbor, is to let the disease burn out before people landed. Now, you can be exposed one day, get 3,000, 6,000, 12,000 miles within a day or two, and get sick 2 days later. And sometimes not even connected to that travel. Because of the way the illness a particular illness occurs. And so you get a situation like SARS. SARS was the classic example. It's a zoonosis. It jumped from animals to people. It spread widely in Guangdong province in China before anybody recognized it. There was a political element to that in terms of the party congress going on. People didn't want anything to disrupt that. There was a physician from Guangdong who went to a wedding in Hong Kong. Would that have been possible even 25 years ago during the Cultural Revolution? No, but it's possible now. People travel everywhere now. He went to a wedding in Hong Kong. He stayed in room 911 in the Hotel Metropole, where he exposed a number of other people who went all over the world. And the story of Toronto. There was no SARS in Montreal. Sorry. This, you know, the Quebec, Ontario thing gets very heated. In Toronto, the story in Toronto is very interesting because there was a couple who went to visit relatives in Hong Kong. They flew on Continental Airlines. As part of the deal, they got 3 days stay at the Hotel Metropole in Hong Kong. They would have never stayed there. They would have never thought of staying there if it wasn't, free. They thought they would try it. They didn't like it. They stayed there 1 day. That 1 day was the day they were exposed to SARS. That 1 day accounted for the 3 members of that family dying of SARS. Going back before anybody even knew that SARS existed, the woman who stayed in that hotel that 1 day died and was buried before SARS was even described. So that wouldn't have been possible before. It's a product of how we live now, and what we eat, what we do, how we travel, how we live. So that is the key to emerging infections in the United States now. It's the key to emerging infections everywhere, because HIV infection, there's good evidence that it was around for about 120 years ago. But if it occurred in a small African village, nobody would have noticed it. Nothing would have indicated that was going on. People were dying of malaria. People were dying of a lot of things. They would have died, and people would just assumed it was one of the things that people die of. Now, in Africa, people live in cities of millions and tens of millions of people, with the opportunity for the spread of infection in those communities, in those large communities, and with the opportunity for rapid travel, for people visiting there, for people coming here. The world is literally a smaller place now, allowing for infections we would have never recognized. Anybody know what Nipah virus is? That may be the next emerging infection. It's a fruit bat virus that has caused infection in a handful of people now, but for the first time, maybe with person-to-person spread. Avian influenza, you heard a lot about. That is an unprecedented thing for us to be observing. It may have happened every 50 years, every 100 years in Asia. We wouldn't know because we would have never been able to notice it. Now we notice that birds across Asia have this avian influenza, and that it might be the next pandemic influenza strain because it can spread to humans. Once it spreads effectively from human to human, there's that potential. So now we have the potential not only for these infections to be emergent, but for the first time in history, we have the potential to actually notice. It's almost a luxury when you think about it, to actually notice this happening. Let me stop there so we can open the discussion.
Great. Thank you. So interesting. You sort of touched on actually one of the first things I wanted to start on, Dr. DiMaria, which is just earlier today, and some of you may have seen it in the Boston Globe, there was an article that was talking about the National Institutes of Health, and Anthony Fauci, who's with the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, says we are now due for a pandemic, that we really haven't had one in a while. We've been sort of observing these things, such as the Asian flu. Would you agree with that assessment, any of you?
Absolutely. We are overdue. Pandemics tend to occur every 20 to 40 years. We can document that as far back as the 19th century. People have heard of 1918 flu. 1918 flu was extraordinary. It killed about 2% of the world's population in a 2-year period. 75% of them died in the first year, 1918, 1919. It was again, it would have never been able to happen if it wasn't for rapid transportation and rapid spread. Although influenza pandemics did happen before that, the potential was there and it happened. We're overdue. We had a pandemic in '57. It wasn't as severe an illness, but virtually everybody got it. So the death rate was high because of the number of people that got it. 1968 was another example, a little bit milder than '57. 1918 was extraordinary because it wasn't only a new virus, it was an extremely virulent virus, and it killed preferentially people in midlife. In fact, the death rate overall in the older population, now the death rate in people who got influenza was very high if you're over 45, but fewer people, the death rate in the population over 45 was actually less than the death rate in the population under 45 in 1918. So that's why there's all this attention to avian influenza because all influenza A, and this, we're talking about influenza A here, are avian influenza. This is a good example of what Len was talking about. All influenza viruses ultimately were zoonoses and are zoonoses.
Fascinating. Even though we're talking about Asian flu, I want to jump over to the flu that we're all dealing with now as we prepare for yet another season. We've had, story after story after story about the lack of flu vaccine, and the flu, as I understand it, kills up to something like 500,000 people a year around the globe. And here in our country alone, something like 36,000 people will die from the flu. 200,000 will end up needing to be in the hospital as a result of flu symptoms. So the question I'd like to sort of have all of you touch on is, in your opinion, what do we need to be doing? Obviously, we're not getting as much vaccine from other countries. We're looking at trying to produce our own. We're looking at seeing if we can have something that's more of an annual shot, or less than an annual shot, I guess I should say. What do we need to be doing? And we don't want to scare people, obviously, because this is a huge concern, and I feel like even though we try very hard in the media to make sure we're not scaring people about the flu, it is a topic of discussion. Dr. Marcus?
Well, clearly the way to prevent flu is with vaccination. And there are only two ways you're going to get vaccine. Either it's going to come from private industrial sources or from governmental sources. And given the tenor of politics in the country today, very clearly we're not going to have a federal government takeover of vaccine production. So given the political reality of today, the only way you're going to get vaccine production is to make it financially worthwhile for the companies to produce it. And the incentive to produce vaccines is considerably less than the incentive to produce Viagra or many other medications that we have today.
As seen on television with every ad that's on the air.
And if there is a guarantee to the pharmaceutical industry that the government will buy up a given supply, and no understanding that the incidence of flu fluctuates, the demand for it fluctuates. It's not a totally scientifically predictable issue, but if the government says, we guarantee that we will buy X million doses, then the industry is guaranteed a profit for that, and they will produce it. And either they're going to produce it locally or we're going to import it. And again, there may be political issues, to try and convince people, well, it's okay that we've imported flu vaccine from country X, but we wouldn't want you to have any other medicine from country X because, that may be unsafe. And so whatever the scientific aspects of that are, certainly the public perception of it is a political hot potato. So those are some of the practical aspects. There's an awful lot that goes into medicine that has nothing to do with biology and molecules. It has a lot to do with politics. And this is the real politic of vaccine supply.
I want to make sure that we're clear with people, too, though. Not everybody's going to get the flu. You have to be exposed to it, obviously, and if you're exposed to it, then hopefully if you've had the vaccine. And Dr. Treadwell, you talked about also just the things that we can do to prevent getting the flu, like washing our hands and things like that. And how, when people are sick, how often do you go to work and say, I'll fight through this today? People don't take the necessary precautions themselves, or, in my opinion, the health, whatever they need to do to take care of their health. Would you agree, disagree?
Yeah, I'm going to tell you, we're out of vaccine in Framingham, so I want to just say wash your hands. And but I think good hand washing is one of the keys. The staying home when you're actively sick is also important. Although it's sort of we live in a society that if you stay out too long with a respiratory illness, then somebody else has to cover for you. So it's a two-edged sword. Certainly, we think that vaccinating healthcare workers is a priority. Much more priority than vaccinating Congress people, by the way. But excuse me, I'm sorry. I can say that, you can't. And although that sounds like we're actually
back to politics,
we're caring for ourselves first. Actually, that's probably a better strategy than than vaccinating elderly patients who, frankly, don't respond as well to the vaccine. But short of that, I don't have. I agree with Lenny that we need more. We need a more reliable source of vaccine that's going to make a profit for our.
And don't we, Dr. DiMaria, maybe you can address this too. Don't we need to spend more time, more money on research to really understand the blueprint, if you will, of these flus? I mean, they continue to change and modify and sort of create new influenza each year because every year's flu is different. But what do we need to do? What do politicians need to get more involved, or are they too involved that we can't study enough of the biological makeup of some of these infectious diseases?
I think it's extremely important, and there hasn't been an incentive. You know how they make flu vaccine? They make it in eggs. Yeah. A chicken has to lay an egg before they can start making flu vaccine. And when you think about it, it's not sort of an optimal circumstance. And there's no incentive to develop other methodologies for making vaccine for the last 50 years because it works, it's cheap, it produces a lot of vaccine. There aren't any obvious other methodologies available because nobody's really looked for them. Now there's some promising ways of making vaccine on the horizon. I think they're going to have to be developed. We've been talking about this for years. I always use the example. My grandfather was was an Italian peasant, and I can just picture trying to explain to him that we're making vaccine in chicken eggs. He would have been like flabbergasted. What do you mean? You crazy? So I think that's very important. Until we value vaccines, and I think vaccines are the most powerful preventive intervention we have. My motto is: if it moves, immunize it, because there's no question. All this. Some vaccines they have side effects. Flu vaccine. We all order antibiotics all the time. We see people with allergic reactions to antibiotics and serious allergic reactions. It happens. Nowadays we're very aggressive about treating hypertension. People actually, their blood pressure drops out, they fall down and hit their head. But, we say, well, the benefit outweighs the risk. Influenza vaccine, I don't remember seeing any serious reactions to influenza vaccine in the thousands of doses I've been involved with. But somehow, you need written consent, there's this mystique. Until we value vaccines, until we stop treating vaccines as commodities, because that's what they are now. It's like canned soup. A vaccine is like canned soup. If Campbell's gets contaminated with ceration, they can't sell Campbell's soup. You can buy some other soup, or you can make your own soup. But vaccines are not like that. They're more like utilities than commodities. We need them. We need to have them available. It's unconscionable that we have to go into this season with this shortage. And we've been warning about this. We have other shortages. PCV7, the childhood pneumococcal vaccine, we've had 3 times where we had to cut back on immunizing children because of shortages in that vaccine. And other vaccines, you can't get rabies vaccine now. We're worried that people will be exposed to rabies and we won't have vaccine available because there's a shortage of rabies vaccine as well. This is happening over and over again. When we started out this season, we were going to have opt-out standing orders in every hospital. The Hospital Association said every hospital, you get a flu shot if you're in the hospital during flu shot season, or you don't get out of that hospital, or you have to push the nurse out of the way. That was great. We were going to have mandatory vaccination of healthcare workers. We're actually drafting regulations for that. Mandatory vaccination of healthcare workers in long-term and acute care, and regulations requiring that every person in a long-term care facility get a flu shot. We were going to have the pharmacists, and this is kind of a somewhat sensitive issue here, but we're going to have the pharmacists do more vaccination in pharmacies because they did 10,000 doses in a pilot, no problems with it, 80% customer satisfaction, highly satisfied. We said, let's roll that out statewide, let them do it statewide. It was like a dream come true, and then I woke up. And there wasn't enough vaccine. This should not and cannot happen. There's no quick fix here, but I think what's going to happen is they're going to license foreign manufactured vaccine. About half all the vaccines we use in this country are manufactured outside of this country. So there's a precedent for that.
All right. Before we kind of jump off this subject or any of the other subjects that they've talked about, I could go on asking a million questions, but you guys are here and you have questions. So who would like to be the first one to ask a question? Yes. And I don't know if you can make your way to the microphone or if it's just loud enough you can speak and I'll repeat what you say. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but I'll repeat it for the Well, I can repeat it if you want for the camera.
I want to make two comments. One, our twin grandson, 4 years old, got Lyme disease.
Okay, your twin grandson got Lyme disease.
Husband got Giardia, so Richard didn't.
Husband got Giardia.
One that was interesting. So definitely it touches all of us, these infections. But what I wanted to ask is having traveled to India, we saw a lot of cases, we have doctor friends there, of leprosy. Not contagious, but still interesting to see it in this century. And when I heard you say that there were other things coming back like yellow fever, and I don't know if smallpox is out there now, but that's certainly been eradicated pretty much in the world. It's fascinating to me to see some of these, what I call old diseases, coming back. And I just wondered if you could comment on some of these kinds of things. Not always infectious, but things that are around.
Okay, so the question is really about old diseases such as leprosy, such as yellow fever, such as smallpox, and as to how they relate right here and now in this time and century. With immigration, right. It's interesting that you bring up India and leprosy. Some of you may or may not know my background, but my mother is from India, and my grandmother was a medical doctor in India and actually started the first leprosy clinic in India many, many, many years ago, obviously. We are seeing a resurgence of leprosy, I believe, around the world, particularly in India. What about that, and what about smallpox? What about, you mentioned yellow fever, I believe, Dr. Mikas. Why are these things coming back again?
Well, you have to attack it by individual disease to answer the question in a sophisticated way, but it's the principle that I
Make
mentioned
it simple.
of the change in the environment or the change in the organism, either an organism that was seemingly on the way out because we had good drugs to defeat it, has become resistant, and now we don't have the right drugs to fight it, so that's why it's coming back. Or there could be an increase, real incidence because of environmental factors. We could be imposing ourselves on exposure to it. So classically, yellow fever, just to use that as an example, is transmitted by a particular mosquito that likes to breed in little containers that you find often in urban settings, and glasses and tin cans and flower pots. And this particular mosquito is a daytime biting mosquito. It often bites indoors, and it's very well adapted for an urban setting. And if you have a very intensive, intelligent campaign, you can markedly reduce the incidence of that particular mosquito. And if you do it intensively and long enough, you can essentially eradicate the infection. Plus, we have a very, very good vaccine, and if you vaccinate the population, in addition to controlling the mosquito, you really can eradicate it. But now, if you want to go in the woods and chop down the trees, you'll find that there's a totally different species of mosquito that lives in the treetops and lays its eggs, not in tin cans, but in the bromeliads. These are plants that live like parasites up in the trees, and they have leaves that form cup-like receptacles, and they hold just a teaspoonful or a cupful of water, which is all that mosquito needs to breed in. And what does it feed on? Well, what do you find in the top of the trees? You find monkeys, which are susceptible to yellow fever. And so there's a cycle of jungle yellow fever, and if you come down and chop down the tree, you literally bring the disease to earth. And that monkey-biting mosquito that never had an opportunity to munch on a human being before, all of a sudden has all these nice lumbermen around to accommodate it and to provide a nice blood meal. And so you can get an outbreak of jungle yellow fever. And when these guys go back home into their city, where the campaign to eradicate yellow fever is over, we're done with that disease, it doesn't occur anymore, now they reintroduce it into the city. That mosquito control population has been reduced, so there are still those domestic mosquitoes, and now you can go from the jungle outbreak to an urban outbreak. So it's very technical why a given disease would reemerge, but that would be an example.
And I don't know if you can answer this question simply or not. These diseases of old, are they more infectious now, or were they more infectious back then, or are they the same? Can you answer that? I mean, it may not be a simple answer.
Leprosy is fascinating, I'm going to give a little pitch here. We're going to there's a public health museum in Massachusetts up in Tewksbury, and I strongly recommend people visit it. But we're going to have a leprosy exhibit there in the coming year because Massachusetts had the only state leprosarium in the United States on Penake's Island in Buzzards Bay between 1907 and 1921, when the last patients were sent to Carville in Louisiana at the National Leprosy Center, or Hansen's disease is more technically accurate. What's interesting to me from a communicable disease standpoint, first of all, we don't really understand how leprosy is transmitted, so to talk about infectious leprosy is very difficult, and it's actually an excludable disease. It's one of the 4 diseases that keep you out of the United States. But, that's one problem. But if you look at the number of reported leprosy cases in Massachusetts, it's the same today as it was in 1915. It's a rare disease. We're only talking about a handful of cases, but it hasn't changed in all that time. It's still out there in low numbers.
Just because I'm curious, what are the other 3 diseases that will keep you out of the country?
HIV infection.
Yeah.
STDs and active tuberculosis.
Oh, okay. Question from the audience. Sir, since you're right by the microphone, why don't you go there, and sir, why don't you get up? So I know they really want these on tape. So you go up that direction and you start over here.
This is fascinating. I want to ask about externalities. If I buy electricity and my power company burns oil, I pay for the oil, but I don't pay for the carbon dioxide. This talk about transmission by transport is fascinating because it's generally believed that bubonic plague came to Europe only when boats became fast enough that everybody didn't die or the rats didn't die before the boats arrived. Now, I'm all for commerce, and commerce is very valuable, but bubonic plague killed 30% of the people in Europe. That's an externality. Where do these costs properly get borne? I love to travel. I love to buy stuff from overseas, but there's a cost. And how do we assess that? Because if we don't assess it, everybody pays for it, and not all of us have the ability to go on ecotourism.
Who wants to tackle that one?
Well, yeah, first of all, I think that in terms of imported diseases, you can think of not only travelers bringing in things, foreign travel to exotic places bringing things, which turns out to be very rare. For example, although we see some malaria in the United States, there's about 10 fatalities a year of malaria, and it's not transmissible here. There's no domestic yellow fever. I want to clear up a misconception. There is no smallpox, because if you do, I think Al's going to retire immediately. Yeah, I know. I wasn't going to talk about that metaphor. I think that travelers bringing in transmissible diseases is extraordinarily rare. I think I worry more about the Gambian rat, which is it never made sense to me to import a Gambian rat and then mix it with a prairie dog. I mean, prairie dogs are beautiful animals, but they belong on the prairie, and I don't think they should be. I think that that's a common sense thing that shouldn't be allowed. What about immigrants bringing in diseases? In Framingham, I've seen about 6 or 8 cases of leprosy, mostly in South Americans. The first case I saw was a Vietnamese individual who I saw for a hand infection, and I noted on examination, the patient had a funny-looking face and had claw hand deformities, and I thought the patient had a form of arthritis we called scleroderma. But I actually asked a resident who was actually born in Vietnam and trained here in the United States to translate for the hand surgeon who needed to do an operation. And I went home, and the next morning the resident, a lovely individual, came up and said, Dr. Sherrill, thank you so much for asking me to see that patient last night. I haven't seen a case of leprosy since I left Vietnam. That's how I made the diagnosis.
Wow.
And I want to share, there are a handful of patients, immigrants who, for example, are diagnosed with leprosy, but the risk to our population approaches zero. And I think that the immigrants in Framingham bring far more to our economy and to the fabric of our community than the risk of contagion. And I think it's well worth the investment in our immigrant population. I think travelers bringing home things, you can bring up the case of SARS, for example. But, the number of foreign travel, which has escalated since 1950, is approaching 1 billion. Of course, 9/11 there was a plateau, but there's going to be about 1 billion foreign travelers by the year 2010, and it's an important part of the economy that can't be measured. So,
good. I believe you wanted a question, sir. Wait till you get to the mic.
My question is around retroviruses and whether or not we can expect that there will be some more emerging diseases from retroviruses. And the second part of it is this the result of what's now being called lateral transfer in the gene pool?
Dr. DiMaria?
It's hard to say. Retroviruses, were the first retrovirus actually was LTV. Oh, no.
HTLV1.
HTLV1, thank you, which was discovered by Dr. Gallo, or identified by Dr. Gallo before HIV. And it turns out there are a lot of retroviruses, both in animals and in people. And there are even endogenous retroviruses, presumably in people, that you do have lateral transfer. So you actually inherit these viruses as part of your genome, and nothing presumably happens unless somebody is doing very specialized studies. So, I think that's another area of genetics we didn't talk about, but there are a lot of issues in terms of genetic predispositions, and there's a lot of issues about what may be in our own gene pool that might be related both to the potential for transmissible diseases, but more so the potential for unrecognized emerging diseases that are not infectious diseases. Is an interesting area, and it's a burgeoning area actually among infectious disease specialists, looking at a variety of concerns around predispositions and protection. Even more important is to study why certain people, for example, don't get HIV infection. I think that led us to recognizing certain genetic characteristics of cell surfaces that favored HIV infection, and it's been an interesting story that I think is going to be, as we become more knowledgeable. And the example with flu virus, too, as we understand the genetics of flu viruses better, which they have a very peculiar genetic characteristic, and they almost have like chromosomes. They have separate gene elements. It'll help us maybe address this whole issue of how to protect people against influenza viruses as well.
Good. Yes, sir.
Just add something.
Why don't you come down to the microphone? Well,
the retrovirus question is a really fascinating one because there are so many possibilities, and one of the new ones is the use of animal tissue for grafting purposes. So they use pig valves, for example, to replace human valves. And pigs very, very commonly have a retrovirus. And so an interesting question is, when you take a pig valve containing that retrovirus and put it in a person that you now heavily immunosuppress in order to let them accept that graft, will that permit this pig virus to multiply? And I don't think we have an answer to that altogether. It clearly is a matter of concern. And then what happens if it does multiply in that one person? Is it going to cause disease, or is it just going to multiply and be happy, and the person is going to be happy? But then are there going to be further problems? Will it multiply in the person and be potentially a new AIDS virus and be transmissible to that person's spouse, and so on down the line? So, there's potential. I don't know that it's going to be reached. I certainly don't want to sound an unnecessary alarm. I mean, these are theoretical considerations. And the cycling of retroviruses is very complicated. With HIV-1, the cause of AIDS, apparently what happened was we got it from butchering and eating chimpanzees, and fortunately for the virus, if you want to look at it from the virus's standpoint, it was very happy in the new host and said, I don't have to depend on people hunting chimpanzees anymore. This is a nice human host, and I can get along just fine with sexual reproduction of my host and get transmitted that way and use blood transfusions, and I'm off and running in this new host. On the other hand, there's an HIV-2 that also came from monkeys, a sooty mangabey, and people who hunted and ate them got infected with it, but it turns out that's not a very good virus for sexual transmission within the human host. But at a certain point in West Africa, there was an attempt to control sleeping sickness by injecting everybody with a drug called pentamidine. And so the Portuguese said, we're going to go into some of our colonies and we're going to do a nice thing for these people. We'll prevent sleeping sickness by injecting this drug, which, by the way, hurts like hell. So it's a very painful injection, and the people were somewhat less than enthusiastic over receiving it. And what happened was that some of the people with HIV, too, were injected with pentamidine, and we were not using sterile needles and syringes at the time, so you just went from patient to patient with the same needle injecting with a multi-dose drug, a multi-dose vial. Beautiful way to transmit that virus. Well, fortunately, it was able to burn itself out in many of these communities, because if you really wanted to keep it going in the people, you had to keep it going in the sooty Mangabe, and they hunted it almost to extinction in some of these countries, like in Guinea-Bissau. And it becomes, a much lesser problem than HIV-1, but it just gives you an example of how complicated that whole business can be.
Just a side note question before we get to this gentleman. How long ago did we finally go to sterile syringes and one single-time use on things like that? I would have thought it would have been a lot longer than.
Well, I can remember sharpening needles. So,
wow.
So it was in the 1960s that plastic needles, plastic syringes and disposable needles came into effect. Prior to that, in the 20th century, usually boiling was used for needles and syringes. But in many parts of the world now, disposable needles and syringes are reused over and over again, and there have been more.
You think we'd learn after?
Well, it's a question. Either you don't get treated because there are not enough needles and syringes, and people decide that they'll take that risk will be faced, and that happens.
Yes, sir. Please.
There's one word I haven't heard tonight, and yet it had this whole country, at least the East Coast, in a tizzy, especially our Congress and our Postal Service. And that word, of course, is anthrax. Now, have we decided, or is the FBI, who can't find Whitey Bulger and can't find whoever started this anthrax plague on us, is that over, or are we to wait for the next chapter in this silent saga?
Before they attempt to answer that, to try and get into the topic of bioterrorism, I think would be sidetracking a little bit, and we could get on to a long discussion. But if any one of you wants to just touch on that ever so briefly, we will.
It was just a proof of concept. And that's why we sort of deal with it as a risk, because, it was proven that it could be a risk and could happen. So, I think we actually, at the state laboratory, we tested 3,500 random environmental specimens and did not find one anthrax spore in that entire, it's sort of surprising because the anthrax occurred in Massachusetts and is in the soil somewhere. But we didn't find it. So I think, from the standpoint of, it can happen, we need to be concerned about it. It is still a concern. But from the standpoint of influenza, it's a very small concern.
Very good. One of the things we haven't talked about, Triple E, Eastern Equine Encephalitis, mad cow. 4 cases this year.
We have, I don't know if people are aware of this, we have 4 cases. More in 1 year than any time, I think, since the mid-'80s or possibly the mid-'70s. I forgot to look at it.
So why, in your opinion, we could, after listening to you, we could surmise a number of reasons, but if you could, why now? With
0 cases of West Nile and 4 cases of
right,
Eastern.
Exactly.
Yes, fascinating. We've been studying, Eastern encephalitis was first described in Massachusetts in 1938. There was a huge outbreak, about 75 cases. Vlado Gedding, who went on to become commissioner between 1943 and 53, actually wrote his thesis about it. Since that time, we've been doing surveillance for Eastern encephalitis, especially in the southeast, where the white cedar and red maple swamps, it's bad for wetlands. It's bad for property values, they swamps. Wetlands occur. We've been observing this, and we do see cycles, and we're worried next year is going to be a bad Eastern encephalitis cycle because it builds up in the bird populations. Again, it's a bird virus. Ultimately, it's transmitted by mosquitoes, and that this year was a warning that we need to be extra observant, extra cautious, and prepared for Eastern encephalitis next year.
There's no vaccine. Is there a vaccine for this?
There is. Okay. There is, yeah. There's a vaccine, a veterinary vaccine. For both West Nile and Eastern encephalitis, and there is a human vaccine but it's investigational and can only be obtained through the Department of Defense. We actually used to vaccinate our staff who worked in the laboratory with the virus, but we don't do that anymore because it's become impossible for us to get the vaccine under the conditions of the investigational license.
Although, before we, jump off the edge and decide we're never going to go outside, I mean...
And not eat.
That's not a bad idea. From my standpoint, if everybody stayed in between April and October, my life would be a lot easier.
There is, I saw a case of Eastern equine encephalitis in 1986. It was really a very unfortunate case, actually. But it is a rare disease, and it could also be that, that next year we'll see no cases or one case. But it's 4 cases is worrisome. But
right. Compared to influenza, it's not a problem.
Okay. Are we out of time?
We are.
We are. Okay. I wasn't sure if it was 8 or 8:15. We're out of time, folks. Thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate it.